see it's on.
Okay.
They're good. I mean, Ken knows what he's doing. It's
For
amazing.
those that do not know, we're waiting for the internet class, the time to start. So here we are. Well, this is a new series. Stan and I are excited. I hope after we do the first one, you'll understand what we're trying to do. Obviously, there's way too many men and women in the Bible to cover all of them. But we decided to start with Moses. And it was interesting this last week. I probably spent 20 hours reading the articles on Moses, heavily with the internet. And most of them missed the main points. It was just unbelievable. A lot of them dealt with the historicity of Moses, which simply means did Moses live or not. And many, many people do not believe that Moses was a real character, a real person. And they give you all these different theories and philosophies and what this ancient person said in Greece and what Josephus said, all of that. And most of it was nonsense and a waste of time. Okay.
And yet, I'll bet in those, almost all of them had this, right? Most all of them had at least the belief that the Red Sea.
Or at least we'll tell you about it.
Yeah.
At least they'll tell you, well, this is in. Obviously, that couldn't have happened. They'll say something like that. Obviously, this really couldn't be. It couldn't really happen. But what we want to do is we want to emphasize a couple of things that pulls it all together. One of the most important things was if Moses was a real person, which of course we believe because it's the Word of God, how does he fit in, and what is the possibilities? Like Les was trying to do today, he was trying to show you the background information there in the book of Jonah to make it make more sense. That's what we're going to try to do. So we're going to start showing you the incredible splendor of Egypt. We have unbelievable records and archaeology from Egypt. So Stan in a few minutes is going to talk about the ancient splendor of Egypt and show what an advanced culture it was. We're going to try to show you why God put Moses where he did. And so we're going to talk about the most books that accept it or even accept it as a story, and nothing but a story. We'll take the view that it happened in the time of Ramses the Great in the 13th century. And we're going to look at an alternate view about a century and a half before that. And then we're going to deal with what kind of an education could Moses have. There was a little bit about that, but not a lot. I remember when I was in grad school and coming back to teach, there was a book on the Pharaoh that had an excellent section that dealt with that. So we're going to let Stan.
I know that you've got improved vision since you had your cataract surgery with the lens replacement. I don't know if you can read that TV or not.
I can't.
So I'm going to read it so that you can comment on this, because excellent introduction of where we're going this morning. And if any of us had gone down this line of thinking, I want to know about Moses pre-Exodus. This is about all you'd get. He who is drawn from water, which is based on Exodus chapter 2, verse 10, brother of Aaron the high priest and Miriam, leader of the Hebrew people in the 15th century BC, chosen by God to lead the Hebrew people from Egypt to Canaan, speaks to God face to face as one speaks to a friend, based in Exodus 33:11. He receives the law of God on Mount Sinai, builds a tabernacle according to God's instructions. Moses is an intermediary between God and the people for 40 years, but dies before entering the promised land at age 120. And that's about all you could find other than the parting of the Red Sea and the Ten Commandments.
He's the most mentioned person in the New Testament. Did you know that? From the Old Testament. That tells you something about it. And if he wasn't a historical figure, Jesus was a foolish person. Okay.
So we went on to find Moses, a Hebrew by birth, and yet we're going to talk here in a little bit about being raised Egyptian. So that's an interesting combination. He spends his first 40 years of his life living in Pharaoh's house, and an additional 40 being a sheep herder for his father-in-law in Midian. was born during the 400 years when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. His biological parents are Amram and Jochebed, and they're from the tribe of Levi. Moses also had an older sister, Miriam, and an older brother, Aaron. So here's some questions that we want you to think about this morning as we go through. When did Moses realize that Aaron and Miriam were his siblings? And how? Well, if you remember the story in Exodus 2, 1 through 10, or if you haven't read it in a while, you read it closely, his own mother is who is called by Pharaoh's daughter to come and nurse him and be his nanny, basically to raise him. So we are going to suggest that he learns about his Hebrew history from his own mom, because otherwise, how would you know? How would you just instinctively know you have an older brother and an older sister? You wouldn't if you grew up if you were adopted into an Egyptian household and they didn't tell you about brothers and sisters you had from Hebrew lineage. And then how did growing up in an Egyptian household and culture prepare Moses for the task God caused him to carry out when he called him at 80? And I was thinking about, I read in another book last night, Moses spent 2/3 of his life being equipped and prepared by God for the 1/3 that God called him to actually do the task that he had lined up for him. So it's just an interesting mindset, stage set. And that leads us into, as Dr. Cloud calls it, the splendor of Egypt. Like, what we read, as Les said this morning, we oftentimes read so quickly that we just, oh, yeah, Egypt, yep, Pharaoh's daughter, Pharaoh, saw it on TV, saw the Ten Commandments. That'll come up here in a little bit too from the motion picture. But the point is that there's a bunch more for all of you who've been blessed and anybody online who's gone over there, especially with Dr. Cloud doing a tour. You learn all kinds of things that just the sheer scale. This picture we put in here because look at the size of the camels and the humans riding the camels compared to the pyramids. And that may be, well, what does that have to do with the Bible? Well, not necessarily anything other than these people pulled off some great feats of architecture. And the scale was so large that it's lost on us sometimes, especially as late as we live, so many years removed from it. We don't think anything of it when we think of 100-floor skyscrapers and all kinds of other things we build. But this stuff is architecturally and scientifically and mathematically very impressive. They were leading the world in all of those areas.
Yeah, over 1,000 years before Moses was born there, these pyramids were built. These three, the big pyramids at Giza, were built over about 1,200 or 1,300 years before. And it took a lot of knowledge to do that. Go ahead.
And so things like the Sphinx that we're all familiar with, if you ever had a book report or any kind of history on Egypt, you know these types of things. But what we're trying to present this morning is not just go down a well-worn path of items we all know. We're looking at stuff like that's how the architecture looked probably in Moses' day.
Yeah, the Sphinx, for example.
Right, for the Sphinx, for example. So, without the chin being eroded and without all the color missing, they actually had color on the structures and on the carvings and on the architectural things that they have in Egypt outside. But over all those years of rain and wind and everything else, just like the sides of the pyramids now look blocky instead of smooth, the color disappeared. And if any of you are saying, well, how do you know that? We'll get to that in just a second. This is your map. You want to talk about Lower and Upper Egypt, or you just want the comment made?
Yeah, well, again, the reason it's called Lower Egypt is because it's sea level and a little bit above that. And the reason it's called Upper Egypt is because of the mountains, the hills. And so it's us, we think of something like North Alabama and South Alabama, Lower Alabama, and so we wanted to show you that and show you again the Nile. Almost everybody and his brother and his dog lived next to the Nile. Very few people live very far away from the Nile. This was your freshwater source.
The source of life, they called it.
Source of life, yes.
And here's another rendering of that same idea, but obviously in a drawing format. And you can see Amarna there, Karnak Cathedral or Karnak Temple.
It's at Luxor, the
Yeah.
Karnak. It had several different names. Today when we go there, we stay, several of you have been with us to Egypt, especially on the trip. I've been 6 times, and a large group of us went in 95, I think it was, 95. That's when Tanya Tucker went with us, and we even got in her book, Nickel Dreams. There's 2 or 3 pages about the Hendersonville. She went with Dr. Rodney Cloud in the Hendersonville congregation, and she mentions in the book, I had just picked up a copy of the book, came and spoke on Wednesday night, and she says that we went down and celebrated New Year's Eve at the Shalom Hotel bar. Well, the bar was just a little bitty corner of there where you bought water and Cokes and everything else. So I wanted to straighten out people. I said, I want to see everybody after class that went to the bar with Tanya. Little humor there.
We just wanted you to see kind of in relation to where other things are. Look at where the pyramids and the Sphinx are way up at the top near the delta, and then how far down things like Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens are. And this will make more sense as we go through. But here's why there's color on the outside, because there's color on the inside. The only difference between the inside and the outside is that the outside is exposed to the elements, right? And so the color ends up getting washed off, blown off, eroded off. But when you step inside, and we spent time on the phone Friday night about this one. I said, hey, where do I tell them this is? And he said, I don't know. He said, it's in one of the tombs, most likely. But we didn't get a location for this, but the point is that this is common. In the hieroglyphic writings and in what we might want to be tempted to call drawings, color was always used. It wasn't just embossed in concrete, or maybe here in our auditorium, it wouldn't just be something the same color as the brick block wall. So color on the outside was used as well. Another example of the hieroglyphics all behind them, and we realized after we put this in that that's the Google Play icon, the App Store icon, and the shopping from Microsoft Store, and we're not really sure why, so just ignore those icons, we're not really sure. But here's an artist rendering of what a temple might look like. Again, you see the top of the pillars have color on them, and you see the scale compared to the humans standing around at the base of the columns. I mean, just massively large architecture. Nothing done in Egypt was done halfway. Nothing done in Egypt was done reasonably. It was all done very big and very loud and very impressive. And so a little bit of kind of teaser for more detail coming at the end. It'll make sense here in a minute. But was Egyptian education kind of what we think? No. You know, I just pulled this. We use several sites that Brian Holloway lets us use that are licensed to where we can broadcast all this stuff on the internet. And this was one that was under education. And you see the ABC blocks and the pen and the pencils and the books and the apple. And that brings back all kinds of different thoughts and feelings, right, about going to grade school, learning. But Moses probably looked more like this. Maybe he ate, maybe he had an apple every once in a while. Don't know how much he had to incentivize the teacher by taking an apple, but he was learning the hieroglyphics that we just saw in those previous pictures that were all over the walls and in colors, and he would have had to have known these symbols and how to read them. And that brings up other things that Dr. Cloud provided, royal names like this one, which is written in pictures, but those pictures we know how to translate to the letters that Dr. Cloud positioned over the top of each one of the images. And this would be an example of a writing that would be on the wall that would be in color, perhaps like this. And then you'd have to understand what those sounds are that you make from each one of those pictures. You want to say anything more about that?
We chose one from a little later because you wouldn't know some of the pharaohs that lived then, but you would know the name Cleopatra. And the Egyptian language is somewhat complex. It's an incredible language. But as Stan is telling you, this was not a poor society. This was a very high-cultured society, rich in education. And you'll see when Stan comes to the last part where we talk about what did Moses actually learn. The royal family could read things like the Akkadian language, the Aramaic language. And so we're just trying to show you the setting. This is that period of time, whether you take the early day of the Exodus, the 15th century, or the late day of the Exodus in the 13th century. This is one of the highest cultures in the ancient Near East here. And Moses is going to grow up here. And this is going to be very, very important for what he's going to do later on. Go ahead.
More examples of hieroglyphics, sacred writings, Dr. Cloud put. And you can see that it goes from letters where you could say, well, okay, maybe if I memorize these, I could spell out my name. But down at the bottom, it starts going to combinations of letters and then ultimately to concepts, right? Concept of a house or a man or a woman or God. Not just the letter G, the letter O, and the letter D you'd have to put together. And we see this, I called them, I'm sure I'm butchering some of this, but like the letter E and the letter Y, you see the wing-like thing for E, and you see two wing-like things for Y, right? And we had a picture that I thought we put in there, but I guess we didn't, where you could see those same shapes in some of the hieroglyphics that are on the walls even today in Egypt, both start with E, in Egypt. And it's interesting when you can recognize from looking at this and see those hieroglyphic writings and see a shape you recognize and then have this table and be able to see what the letter is. But the reason we're stressing this so much is that I think we quickly read the story of Moses, get to all the things as we should that are biblically there for everybody to kind of hitch their wagon to as factual, but we forget that all this background would have taken place and would be necessary for Moses to be the human being that Moses was. So you may have picked up on my sermon on December 18th. I used some of this just because it's a recurring theme. The Hebrew words for ark and basket are actually the same word. The concept in Hebrew of pitch and tar to assemble the waterproofing for the ark or Moses' basket are the same words. And so it makes a perfect association that what little infant Moses is put in to keep him from drowning with death all around him in the form of water is the exact same construction and waterproofing that Noah is given about the ark that puts he and his family in it that keeps humanity from being wiped out in the flood. And most people don't know that. And oftentimes a basket, I don't know about you, but I mean for me, when I was a kid and I would think of this, I was like, well, it must be some kind of basket we don't have because the baskets I carry around or Cheryl has, you can see daylight through the weaving, right? So if you throw that in the water, it's not going to be very long and that baby's going to the bottom. But these had treatment to them just like the ark did.
Yeah, you have to keep in mind, the more we find out about Egypt, you understand the story a lot better. You think, well, I guess God protected him from the crocodiles. No, what happened was the Nile had all of these canals built off of it, and one came out and went right to the palace. And they had it fixed that the crocodiles couldn't get in. So when the princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, and her, Na'araz, believe it or not, her highly educated and important people attending her. This would have been in the canal that led there, so the crocodiles. So that's where the sister of Moses, where Miriam put Moses in there. And so the more you understand about their culture and their buildings and their skills and all that, you understand the story so much better.
So you just taught me something. That's complete ad-lib. I didn't even know he was putting that in, about crocodiles. So when was Moses' time period then, Dr. Cloud?
Okay. So we're interested in showing you not only the high culture and the richness of Egypt. We want to show you what most likely was the time period when Moses lived, very important time in Egyptian history. So we're going to show you two, but the one that a lot of scholars want to accept is Ramses the Great. because Ramses the Great was one of the more powerful pharaohs living in the early part of the 13th century. And Ramses the Great lived a long time. He lived 67 years, ruled 67 years, and had 79 children, sons and daughters. Busy. But he had a harem, of course. He did. But there was a main queen that went along with Ramses. And so a lot of people have gathered around the idea that this was the time of the Exodus, even the ones that believe in the Exodus. And so that's what makes it to the screen and movies and everything. So this is Ramses the Great, also known as Ramses the Second.
And you did a trick for him here to connect back to our architecture. This is really that size, which is 7 stories tall, right?
Yeah, each one of those statues are 7 stories. Those are all statues of Ramses. He had a smaller area where his main wife, she got a little statue. I forgot what hers, maybe a story or two. But Ramses was 7 stories high. This is on the lake down there, not very far from one day. A tremendous story behind that. They had when they built the dam there and built the big lake, this would have been underwater. And all these people raised money from all over the country, all over the world, and sent. And they just barely got it up there before the water would have flooded it forever.
You can see the importance of Ramses II just out of the sheer volume and the multiple carvings and the effort that was put in to him representing Egypt. Unfortunately today, I don't know exactly where this is, but in some of my software, I found this current file or image, which is just a bust of him, and you can see some of the graffiti on his shoulder and on his beard. So I guess it all comes eventually to where people get far enough away, they don't respect who the people were like they did before.
This is a shot of Ramses in battle. He's actually there. I have one on my wall in my office, riding in his chariot. But these are all authentic pictures. Some of them from fighting the Hittites, from fighting many battles, and that's Ramses the Great right there. Right.
Yours is papyrus, though, right?
Yeah, on the back wall. Mine is papyrus, and
with color on the papyrus.
Yeah, painted from the original, but painted by the students at Cairo, at the University of Cairo. Of course, the movie, you remember, Yul Brynner played Ramses the Great. Again, that shows how much it had shifted. There were 3 different views on the Exodus done by scholars, and now basically there's 2. Ramses the Great, and people want him to be the Pharaoh because he was unbelievably powerful, no doubt about it. He outlived his first 13 heirs. Okay, he outlived his first 13 heirs when Merneptah took over. And this, of course, is a scene from the movie. You see Charlton Heston talking to Yul Brynner there. All right, go ahead. Okay, we're going to give you a little scenario that I think you'll appreciate. In fact, if any of you own the NIV Study Bible, or the Geneva Study Bible, or the New King James Study Bible, in the footnotes will give you the view I'm about to give you. That they're all done by conservative scholars and believe in the early date of the Exodus. So we're going to come we're going to start out with Hatshepsut. Let me tell you the story, and I think you'll understand what happens. In an archaeological magazine done by one of the companies groups that I dug with, and some of the people from here was dig, for example, Sue McPherson and others on this dig. They came out with an article in their magazine. They have a magazine called Bible and Spade, and they call it the Family Feud. It's what they named the article, but it was written by good scholars. But basically, here's what happened. When Egypt broke away, finally recovered from foreign dominance that controlled the land, one of the main pharaohs was a man named Tutmosis the First. And you can pronounce it Tutmos, and then there's spelling Tutmosis. You'll see different spellings. But anyway, and he had a main wife, and they produced a daughter named Hatshepsut. Now, just the way to remember that, I'll never forget what our guide did on the cruise. On that particular trip to Egypt, we actually took a cruise up the Nile. We flew down to Aswan and then made stops coming north. And anyway, the guide on the lady on the cruise, the guide had graduated from the University of Cairo, expert in this area. And she said, just think of a hat and a cheap suit and say hat, cheap suit, and you'll really be close. I can see the excitement there.
I saw a few. But while you're on names, do something for us. Tutmosis and Moses, drawn from.
Yeah, Tutmosis means born of the god Thut. Ramses means born of the god Re or Ra, the sun god. Okay, that's in the alphabetical part. Like I said, the Egyptian language is somewhat complex, very, very beautiful. Anytime you look at a picture and you see a door and hieroglyphs on both sides, the hieroglyphs always the faces face the door. So if you're on the right-hand side, they're facing to the left. If you're on the left-hand side, they're facing. Go to a museum, and they've got that. And so you read Egyptian, you read it against the faces. So you translate the one on the right-hand side, left to right, and you do the one on the right-hand side, right to left. Does that make any sense at all? So anyway, it's a beautiful language, very, very attractive. Originally pictures. Many languages were originally pictures. Like someone had sheep, they wanted to keep a record of their sheep. You had a picture of a sheep with the number of lines showing how many sheep they had. Does that make sense? Just little lines like that. So anyway, it's a beautiful language, and it really makes sense. And they finally cracked it. They cracked it by looking at the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone that was actually first owned by Napoleon when he took a group there, and then the British took it from his men. But it had a Greek column, a cursive Egyptian column, and hieroglyphs. We couldn't read the other two columns, but we could read Greek. And so they began first by saying these cartouches. So when you saw Cleopatra's name a while ago, that's in a cartouche. That symbol that she was in means she was royalty. She was a person of high breed royalty. So anyway, all right, let me get back to the story because our time's going to get away from us. So Tutmosis the First, by his wife, had Hatshepsut. No boys. Had boys by the other queens, the lesser queens, by the harem. And she was a very important person. When he died, he made Tutmosis the Second. I know you need a scorecard for this, but Tutmosis the Second, born to a harem queen. He made him Pharaoh. He was only 9 years old. He had married, so he married Hatshepsut to her half-brother. But they only had a daughter. They did not have any sons either. So it turned out that Tutmosis the Third was actually born to Tutmosis the Second. But he was only 9 years old when that happened. And so she was his aunt, his stepmother, and some people believe they married. He married the daughter, and therefore her son-in-law, and the powers that be made her regent. And when they first came out, he was in front on the pictures of them, the drawings, the carvings, and she was standing behind. But she took over and kept him in school. He was doing that training that Moses he was involved in that training that Moses was going to get, or already probably had gotten. And so she, gradually though, she declared herself Pharaoh and moved herself in front of him on the wall, and so there was a little hatred there. My chronology puts Moses in the early date older than Tutmosis III, so he would have been a rival. But Tutmosis III became Pharaoh because he did have the royal blood, and this was a slave or an adopted child. Then, so I believe that Tutmosis, so let's go ahead and, this is Hatshepsut's temple. She put this burial temple on the other side. She did have the courage to go into the Valley of the Kings, and next to the great kings like, that later would be Ramses and all the other great kings. So she put it on the other side of the mountain there, and we used to stop here all the time, and the bus went right up to it. It's a rather large temple, as you can see. Okay, so anyway, gradually what happened was Tutmosis III, grew up, and all kind of theories happened. Possibly he killed her, because Moses would have been a challenge to him, being an older brother, even though he was adopted. But in any case, what happened was she is probably assassinated. We're not quite sure what happened, but she dies. Moses becomes king, and then Moses is still there as a little older child. Why would you flee the land of Egypt if you were a prince and you killed a taskmaster? They were considered nothing. But this was an excuse for him. So my view is that Moses fled because he was afraid of Tutmosis III. There probably had been a lot of tension. We know there was tension between Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III. And so he would have been the Pharaoh of one of the pharaohs of the oppression. Moses is gone. When Moses comes back, he has died, and Amenhotep II. So now we have Tutmosis, and we have a comment from Stan.
Well, I was just going to say, just in case some people I'm seeing them doing heavy cranial work. So the last Pharaoh of the oppression, and Moses would have been about 40 years old when Tutmosis III was Pharaoh.
Right.
And then he leaves and goes to Midian. Tutmosis passes away, and the son of Tutmosis III, Amenhotep II, is now Pharaoh. So he's now younger than Moses is, because Moses is now 80, being sent back by God to come and tell the Pharaoh to let his people go.
Right. And again, there's so much evidence to put together, but the 10th plague, what happened? The son of Pharaoh was killed in the 10th plague. Tutmosis, Amenhotep II, he is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and then later on he has a son called Tutmosis IV, but we found a stela of his, a monument, in between the paws of the Sphinx. They dug down, and there it was, called the dream stela. And he said, I had a dream, and he tells about becoming king, and he says, I wouldn't have been king, but my older brother died. And so many Egyptologists think that is the son who died during the 10th plague. That makes sense. So anyway, this is a very quick snapshot of what could have happened here. And this is the view in the footnotes in the study Bibles that I mentioned to you a while ago. Now, Dad's going to tell us the kind of education Moses. So if you want to know if he's a historical character and why God put him in Egypt, Stan's going to tell you.
Yeah, so why do we spend this time telling you all this about the pharaohs? Is imagine, even though many of us get called by God to do different things and we may be reluctant to do them, imagine Moses being called at 80, which many now would think, well, who would start something at 80, right? To start an endeavor like that for that many years, 40 years in the wilderness and leading the people. One of the authors I was reading said, imagine Moses when we know biblically about him telling God, I'm not a good speaker, and God says, I'll be with your mouth, and all the excuses, and he gets Aaron and all that stuff, and he finally goes, right? But also think about the things that we don't explicitly get told, that because of what we're talking about this morning with the education and the contrast to the other Egyptian upper echelon of society, Moses is going to speak to the king of Egypt. And he doesn't know how God's going to do what God's going to do. He doesn't know when God's going to do what God's going to do. He just knows God sent him, and he's supposed to tell him to let the people go. So he's got to have some education. He's got to have some way of carrying himself to where he would even be anybody that the king would listen to, or that he would even entertain a conversation with. He has to be able to interact at that level. So we're simply inviting you to consider some of this, that in ancient Egypt there was a rigid hierarchy throughout the educational system, with separate schools for each class, and this hierarchy carried throughout professional life. And the princes went to a school. Princes, like the sons of the kings, went to a school where the nobility and Pharaoh's sons were educated. They would go to preparatory school, kind of, compared to public school, right? Or maybe even there wasn't a public school. Maybe this was just because they're in the family line that they're in, they get an education where others might not. Moses' education then would have been similar. He's been adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, so he's in the palace. So he's going to go right along with all the other little boys and little girls that go to school that are palace kids, right? So he's going to get that same education that anyone in that echelon or that hierarchy level would get. And Moses' education would have included the following, as Dr. Cloud alluded to earlier: reading and writing of hieroglyphics, Canaanite, Proto-Hebrew language, Aramaic, Ugaritic, Hittite, and especially the dialects of Akkadian, which are what things are written in, like the Amarna letters and other things that we have, that we can go back and see that they connect. Just like you were saying, the dream stela, if my older brother hadn't died, well, we know a story over here in the Bible that says that a son of Pharaoh was killed in the 10th plague, and now we have something outside the Bible saying that an older brother died and he was never able to be Pharaoh, and you can see where I'm going. You've got to be able to read these other records in these other languages Moses would have known. So if he comes in with all this knowledge, then he's more respected as an equal to any of the children or any of the generations that would have been educated in the palace. And Moses mastered ancient Near Eastern creation and flood stories. Why do we say that? Well, because, yes, we do understand that God can inspire people, and we believe that, and we know that that's true, and that Moses didn't witness the creation firsthand. But when he wrote it down, he had to have at least known what he was writing it in as a contrast to, or as a polemic to, which is all the other stories he'd been taught in school on how the world came about, how everything was made. This training provided him the education to write the first 11 chapters of Genesis and correct the pagan ideas already rampant in the Fertile Crescent. Also, Moses' education, he studied treaties and law codes and customs, which prepared him to write the bulk of Genesis 12 through Deuteronomy, all of the part about the law, all the part about the book of the covenant. Now, yes, he went up the mountain and God gave him the 10 Commandments, but there's a whole lot more in the Pentateuch than just 10 words. There's all the other things, if this happens and this happens, and this is what you have to do in restitution for this person if your animal gets loose. He was familiar with all that stuff because he had read those types of treaties outside. And I would even say covenant language, like the vassal treaties, he would probably be familiar with as well, which came from the other civilizations and their gods, the deity that would witness a signing of a covenant, and then that all made sense to him when God, Yahweh, did that with the covenant there at Sinai.
Remember, Moses is going to have to explain this during the 40 years. He's going to be teaching the people all about the creation stories, the flood stories, the false things they had heard, and he's going to be teaching them Genesis through Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is structured just like an ancient Hittite covenant. And Exodus 20, I could take Exodus 20 and show you when he gave the law, how the parts are just like an ancient covenant. But Moses had to understand all of that.
Yeah, and then it gets even deeper. He's got, as children of the royal palace were trained, he would have also had things like being trained to lead the armies into battle at some point. So he would be a leader of people. If, in fact, the Pharaoh were to fall, they would all get trained on how to replace them. Make laws and covenants. Hence, there was need to be trained in the military, to know geography, to understand what he would be leading people into. Astrology and astronomy, because that was very high in their belief systems. And then trained to be oratory, so that he could actually give commands and people would listen to him. All of those things, plus for Dr. Cloud being a mathematician, he would also have needed to know math, and magic is up there. Why would we put magic up there? Not magic like slip of the hand stuff, but the gods of Egypt, the little g gods that do come into the beginning of the plague story, where we realize the Bible contains this information, and there are magicians and there are people doing things. He would have been skilled somehow or schooled somehow in at least the existence of that stuff, and possibly which deity was responsible for it being real. All of that Moses would have. And I think no matter how you're feeling or what you're thinking right now, this makes a lot of sense, because where God calls people, he always calls people he's equipped in certain ways. He's not going to call, for example, somebody who's highly, highly skilled in a trade, like flying an airplane, let's say, or something like that, to go do accounting. If he knows he's got a Christian accountant, he can call to go do the accounting part. And so Moses is equipped with all of this stuff that when God calls him at the burning bush and says, I'm sending you to Pharaoh, he can talk to Pharaoh, he knows the language of Pharaoh, he knows the concepts of Pharaoh, he knows the educational system of Pharaoh, and he knows how to talk to people, he knows how to lead people, he knows all of this stuff he's been trained for, and that's, I think, we're saying why God calls him as the person that plus he's faithful to God, and he's a believer, obviously. Those are the core constituents, but he knows all this other stuff that allows him to actually perform the job. And then we would just end this way. Moses, God co-working with a human being to rescue God's people from enslavement. And paradigmatic for the rest of the story, right? How many human beings does God co-work with, ultimately Jesus of Nazareth being the ultimate one, to free his people from enslavement? Not just Hebrew slavery in Egypt, taskmasters, but us to sin and to death, right? So it is the pattern, it is the paradigm that repeats in the Bible over and over and over again, whether it be through prophets or ultimately in the Son of God himself. And so we hope we've added something to you for Moses, and we still have 2 minutes because that clock's 2 minutes fast. So next week we're going to go to New Testament authors, since we've just said that there is inspiration, but yet people are called with how God has equipped them through life. The authors of the New Testament have been equipped in different ways. That's why there's not one person who wrote the whole thing.
We're going to tell you about every author of the New Testament next week, just next week. Every author, not only what we know about them from ancient history, etc., but also what the tradition says happened to some of them and how they were equipped to write. And so that should help you. But as you can see, we've just touched the hem of the garment with Moses. But we wanted to show you. I mean, you don't pick out somebody to edit the Britannica Encyclopedia unless they're prepared to do that. Moses is going to be able to teach the people this, teach them how to read and write, and teach them all the essential things. Develop a priesthood and a people who could take care of themselves after that.
And maybe one thing we forgot.
Okay.
He also is a diplomat between the people and God. When they have that little conversation about your people have done this, and Moses says, wait a minute, it's not my people, it's your people. And so there is an intermediary that Moses is from God's own people to Yahweh himself.
Just think how uneducated the people he took out of Egypt were. His job is to get them educated, get them prepared, and all, and to deal with problems continually.
All right. I can see the excitement for coming back next week. So with that, why don't we close with a quick prayer. Father, thank you for this new quarter, this new study. Thank you for allowing us to have so much information from archaeology and from other sources that allow us to look and point to what we know is true and we've always believed in Scripture, but we get to fill in some of the color that's around it. Thank you for Moses and how you equipped him and how you called him and how he's an inspiration to all of us. That really, when we think about all the complaints that Moses had when you called him, one of which was he was an old man, and how you gave him leprosy for just a second and then took it away, showing him that it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter anything. When you call us and you enable us and you make us successful for what you've called us to do, and we thank you for that. And we ask that as you send us out into the world this week, and whatever each one of us is called to do, that we will remember that with you all things are possible. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I used to think that Moses was old at 80, but see, he's 7 years younger than me.